in the previous tutorial, we looked at kind of the general implications of global illumination. Anytime you see a scene that looks really gorgeously lit, most likely the artist that created the scene used global illumination in their render. It's a really powerful tool, and it creates really, really beautiful, physically accurate lighting. So let's look at the particle emitter and kind of a way we can do some cool, fun effects using global illumination, and as a way that we can have our objects actually glow. And yeah, let's take a look at how that looks. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new scene, and we're going to look at this particle emitter. So we need to go up to the Simulate tab up here, which is where if you're doing stuff with cloth, with particles, with hair, right, that's where all of these simulations happen. And we're going to go down to particles. We're not going to worry about thinking particles at all right now, but we are going to be working with particles. So I'm going to click on the emitter, and what I get is this, square box facing along the z-axis. Now you're going to want to be in your standard layout because the particle emitter requires us to use the animation features of Cinema4D. So if I hit the play button down here, you'll see that these little white lines start emitting from the square. And you'll see they sort of randomly populate, and they move out a certain distance and then stop. And so let's look at some of the attributes for the particle emitter and see what they do. So make sure you have the particle tab highlighted. And so our first option is the birth rate editor, the birth rate renderer. What that means is how many particles are coming out each frame each frame in the editor and once we render it. Right, so if I bump this up to 100, right, you'll see that I'm getting significantly more particles flowing out of this thing. If I was to pause this on any one of these frames, like say here, and render this, I'm not going to get anything, and that's because I'm emitting the particles, but the particles don't have objects attached to them. You can imagine that each one of these little white dots is a null object, right? It doesn't have anything there. It's just waiting to hold some object from Cinema4D. And so, so let's go ahead and do that really quick so we actually have some objects in there. So I'm going to go ahead and create a cube, but I don't want it to be 200 centimeters by 200 centimeters. I mean, we could do that and make it a child of the emitter, and you'll see what happens if we jump back to frame 0. And nothing happens, and we'll talk about why. But let's shrink this down first. Let's go ahead and set it to be 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters to start with. It's pretty small, so let's go ahead and just zoom our view in. And move your camera around so we can really see the particles coming out of this. And we should probably be somewhat, on a side view of this. And so if I go ahead and hit play, right, you can see these particles emitting, and the length of these lines basically is an indication of how quickly the particles are moving. And we'll talk about that in a second. So I have this in here, but I'm not seeing any cubes. And so if I click on my emitter and I go down to my particle tab, down at the very bottom, the second option from the bottom is Show Objects. If I do that, if I turn that on, now the objects that I'm trying to emit are actually being shown. And if I was to pause this and render it, right, I actually see those cubes in space. And so why do we have this option to show or not show? Because showing the objects takes, especially if we start increasing this to say, I don't know, 1,000 particles per second, right? You can see how much more slowly this is going, especially as I get further along. If I have too many objects showing and I'm running through this in real time, what happens is eventually Cinema4D crashes. And so by turning off Show Objects, right? This allows me to increase the number of particles. You know, I can easily do 10,000 if I, right? And it renders basically in real time. It might be a little bit slower, but it's not an issue, right? And then once I pause this, I can turn on show objects, and maybe after a little bit, it'll actually show those objects, right? But now I have this single frame of all these objects, but I'm not showing it while I'm trying to work, right? Because this would make my life impossible. And that is, I don't even want to do it. All right, I can rotate my view barely, but that is an immense number of objects. So I'm going to turn that off. But there are times when you would want potentially 10,000 points. So I'm going to turn show objects off, and I'm going to wait for that to update because my computer can barely handle that. But something else to note, let's say I set this back to something more manageable, like 1,000, and I show objects, and I wait for it to do its thing. There we go. I've got 1,000 cubes. If I render this, which shouldn't take too long, right, I get 1,000 cubes here. However, if I go to render this in the picture viewer, I only get a handful of little dots. And that's because my birth rate renderer is set to 10. I need to make sure that if I want 1,000 objects, you know, I have 1,000 objects. Now, I don't know why that just jumped back to another scene, but I'm going to go ahead and, change this to 1,000. And now if I render this in the picture viewer, right, I should actually get 1,000 objects. And you'll see it looks a lot denser here, and I think there's actually, it's angry at me because I think this is, for some reason, still rendering the 10,000 objects that I created. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this at 1,000. I'll leave this at 1,000. I'm going to turn off show objects so we can actually look at some of these other things that we need to do. And I'm going to go back to 0. So this is pretty boring, right? All these particles are flying out in a straight line from the object. So how do I adjust that? How do I adjust speed and some other things? So first, there's this start emission and stop emission settings. We're just going to go down. We definitely want it to be 100% visible. But the start emission is at frame 0, and the stop emission is at frame 150. We only currently have 90 frames in here, so let's go ahead and just change this value here from 90 to 300. And then let's go ahead and stretch this little gray line by clicking on the end out to 300 so we can see all 300 frames. So at 150, it should stop emitting. Right? So I could, I could make this, you know, start a little bit later too. Maybe I could say, oh, it's not going to start emitting until frame 50. This is more important for if you're doing animation and you want something to do like a spurt of activity, you know, that's when you would do this. For static stuff, there's no reason to start at a different frame rate. The stop emission is important because you might only want a certain number of clones to come out at a certain density. If we come down here, the next option is seed. And if you adjust the seed value, it basically changes the order with which these start populating, right? The random places they originate at. Relative speed, I honestly don't know what that does. So I'm going to go ahead and look at it. Okay. So basically, again, this is an animation thing, but if it's unchecked, they're going to go at a certain speed no matter whether or not the emitter is moving forward or backward or sideways or whatever. They're all going to move at the same speed. Relative means that it would be 600, you know, whatever the speed is, plus or minus the motion of the emitter itself, which we're not going to worry about for our purposes. Lifetime is how long these little particles last. 600 frames means they're going to be there forever, but if I set this to, say, 50 frames, and let this play out, right, then if I zoom out a bit more, you'll see that they stop there, but if I go to 600, then they are going to continue out past the edge, right? It basically terminates how far away from this object or how long away from this object are these things going to last. We're going to leave it at 600 because we're going to do some other things that make that variation. Right now there's 0%. That means every single one makes it to 600 frames. But if we set this to 100%, then we should have a much different density as this thing goes, because some are going to die right away, some are going to last longer. If I zoom way out here so we can actually see this, they should start falling off at some point, but we have so many particles that it's really hard to see that. So maybe if we set this to 300, right, and I'm actually going to stop this and go back to frame 0, they should start dying off, and there should be fewer and fewer of them as we get close to 300 frames. And you'll see that, yeah, the cloud gets a little less dense at the end. If I set the lifetime to, say, 50 frames, right, you can see a much more dramatic change in how these things erase, and the fact that they're doing it with a really nice gradient of disappearance. Okay, so I'm gonna boost this back up to, let's just do 300. The speed is pretty normal. That's how many centimeters is it moving per frame. So if I set this to 300, right, you can see the last ones that just came out are accelerating through there. That's pretty funny, right? So they're going a lot faster. And if I set it to, say, 50, and jump back to the beginning, you'll see that that goes much, much slower. And so that's another thing that, another setting. Again, we can vary that speed. So we can say, okay, well, let's set this to 100%. And then we will, right? And so now some of these particles are moving faster, some of these particles are moving slower, right? That may be a really useful thing. The rotation we'll talk about once we have objects in there, but basically, right, are the particles all coming out in straight lines, or do they rotate? And I don't know if I set this to, say, 60 degrees with 100% variation, if you can actually see that on the particles. I don't really see them rotating, but once you get objects on there, you can see them rotate. So let's go ahead and actually show our objects, but let's reduce our count to 100. Right, so now you can see that this is really slowing down, but you can see that the cubes, instead of all being aligned, they're all at very different levels of rotation, right? And so, and then there's this end scale, right? Do we want the objects to be the same size or larger or smaller when they get to the end of their life? So let's go ahead and set this to 5, right? And so, and there's no variation on this, so they should all slowly grow. And I'm going to adjust this down even lower to 50 so that I can see this. And so you can see that they are slowly growing in scale as they get closer to the end of their life. And then eventually, right, some of these are getting bigger, and so you can see that those are growing. Conversely, we could start out with larger objects and have that end scale be much smaller. So I could say, 0.1 is my end scale. And you can see that as they continue to be on screen, they get smaller and smaller until they finally disappear. Okay, so that's the general settings of the particle emitter. It's a lot. The emitter also has the opportunity to either be a pyramid or a cone, and to have an X size and a Y size, and then also to have horizontal or vertical angles. So if we set this to 50 and 50, and then I stop this and restart it and hit play, right, you'll see I'm still getting the same number of clones, but they're essentially at a higher density because there's less area for them to be in. The other thing I can do is I can adjust this angle. Now, so if I say like 60 degrees and 60 degrees here, and stop this and come back, and I'm actually going to go back to particle. I'm going to turn off show objects because we don't need to do that, and I'm going to increase this to at least 1,000 particles again. And right, so now you can see that it's creating this cone of particles that are flying out. Right? And there's no need for me to even do just 60 I could do 360 degrees in both directions. And then when this starts, particles are going to be flying in every direction from this object, right? And so that is some of the ways you can do this. If I do a cone instead of a pyramid, I can adjust the size, and I have this set to 360 degrees, which is actually just making it a tube again. So if I set it to 359, let's see what happens when we do that. I'm going to jump back to the beginning. Now it's still doing the same thing. I can't remember if the angle has to be less than 180 for the cone. I'm pretty sure, yeah. That's probably what happens, right? So this is with the angle being 120 degrees. So you can see I can use this to get like more spread in the way my particles go out. So I'm going to go ahead and set this angle back to 0. And I'm going to leave it as a cone style for now. Because what I want is I want all these particles to come out at once. The other thing I want to do is I'm going to reset some of the defaults in terms of speed, just so that it's all even. So instead of having this variation, 100% variation, I'm going to say 0% variation in speed. I'm going to say 0 degree rotation and 0 variation here, because I want these all to be even, because the next steps we're going to do are going to make some big changes. So the other things we can do with particles is we can apply forces to them. And so if I go back up to my Simulate tab, and I go down to Forces, actually I'm going to click on this little bar here to pop this out, so I just have all my forces at the ready. You'll see I have this attractor button here, and I'm actually going to make this a little bit. I'm going to make it bigger, but the buttons don't get bigger. That's hilarious. So I have this attractor button here. I'm going to click on this, and there are attractors, deflectors, destructors, field force, which we're not going to worry about right now, friction, gravity, rotation, turbulence, and wind. So if I go ahead, and let's just do a deflector to start with. If I create a deflector, and I pull this deflector out forward, what it does is when particles hit it, they bounce off of it, right? And so this is, shooting these particles back, backwards. If I click on the deflector itself, you'll see that I have a few options here. I have the amount of bounce, this split beam option, which if you have ever used lasers, right, basically it's going to take half of the beam or a third of the beam or something is going to pass through, and some of them are going to be bouncing off. I wish there was a way to adjust the amount, the ratio, but there's not. So if I was to go ahead and rotate this a few degrees, right, you can see that I can actually get these things to bounce in different directions. I'm going to uncheck split beam, and then the size, I can just adjust the size of it, right? So I can use a deflector. The other, something else I can use is an attractor. If I hit the letter E, you'll see what's happening there is basically what happens when stars get close to a black hole but not within it, or anything gets close to a big gravity source, right? And they get shot out everywhere, right? But so this is the attractor. You can see that, it pulls these particles toward it, and they circle it. There's some math going on there. And you can see with the default settings that I've got set, I'm actually getting this really beautiful spiral of particles around here. If I move this over into the stream a bit, right, things are going to get somewhat crazy. Some of them get caught, some of them don't. And so this is a really nice setting. With the attractor, there's this speed limit that's set really, really high by default. The strength is what allows us to adjust, if I make this an order of magnitude larger, it's going to suck all those particles in there, right? And spray them all over the place at incredibly high speed, right? So, so you can adjust the strength of it. The speed limit, you can slow that down dramatically so that your particles, even if you have a higher strength, your particles don't just launch into everywhere. So if I just set this to 2000 and make the strength 100 then, right, I'm still getting, particles going everywhere, but it's a little bit more slow than the previous one, right? If I set this down to 20, I don't know what happens if it's low, if the attractor actually slows the particles down. Oh, it slows them down from the get-go, right? So they're trying to come towards it, but they're going way too slow. So if I set this to 200, right, then it really changes the way that attractor attracts particles, right? So that's another one of the options, is an attractor. You can also, if I uncheck both the attractor and the deflector, because I only really want, one force on here at a time as we're learning about this. If I go down and go to gravity, right, that basically turns gravity on for the particles. And, right, the acceleration is in centimeters per frame. There's some other options here we're not really going to cover too much right now, but, right, so I can do gravity. I can slow gravity down significantly if I make it, say, 100 frames, or 100, right? It should create a gentler spill out of there. If I make this negative 100, then I actually have anti-gravity, right? So things are actually going to float up, right? So if you're, say, wanting to make something that looks fire-like or something, or smoke, this is a way that you could actually use a particle generator to have something lift up and float. And so there is, let's see here, what else is in here? Turbulence and rotation, right? So let's go ahead and add some turbulence to this. And by default, you're not going to see a whole lot. I'm going to turn off gravity for the time being. And so you can see that I'm getting a little bit of disturbance in the spread at this point. Now, turbulence can do some really amazing things. So I'm going to go ahead and select my emitter. And I'm going to change this birth rate editor to 10,000 because I really want a lot of particles for this. The speed's pretty good. Lifetime I'm going to set to 600. Actually, I might make the emitter. Let's go. I'm going to say it's just going to emit the entire number of frames I've got, so 300. So it just keeps flowing out. And you can see how it's causing all this turbulence in the way these particles move. If I select turbulence, there's different things I can do. So currently, right, the stream is going to go straight until it hits that turbulence, right? And even beforehand, you can see, right, there's this range of influence that's happening around here. So the first thing I can do is I can adjust the strength. So if I set this to, say, 20 centimeters, right, they're going to start going crazy in all directions, right? They're moving a lot faster away from one another. If I set it to 50, it just starts to get, like, really crazy, and any further than that, and things get nuts. So I'm going to leave this set to, I'm going to set this to 10, actually. That should be a little bit more manageable. And then there's the scale. Right now, the scale is really, really tiny. But if I start to increase this scale, you get some really beautiful forms, right? These start to look almost like flocks of birds, or, there's all sorts of different ways this works. And this is at 33% scale, right? If I go bigger, I get much larger sweeps of how these particles work, right? It's a really gorgeous event, right? You get, it's just a beautiful flow, right? So I'm gonna, but I'm, and then I can go even higher, and it just goes totally nuts in all directions. I can reduce the frequency down so it's a little bit calmer. So if I do like a lower scale and a lower frequency, all of these things just slightly adjust the way the particles get distributed in space. And I'm not going to render 10,000 cubes right now, but, you can get the sense of, what these particles look like. They create really beautiful, density and things as they go. So let's reduce our turbulence scale, down to something significantly smaller. Like maybe 7%. Let's just see what happens when this cleans up. Okay, that's still, a little big. Maybe my strength should be, let's set the strength to 5. And just see if we get a little bit cleaner. There we go, right? So we're getting some things happening here. And this is something that I'm going to want in my example, but not quite yet. So I'm going to turn that off for the time being so that we can now add the last thing, which we're going to do is rotation. Wind basically blows, right? It blows. But here's rotation. And here's what rotation does to your particles, right? It creates basically a tornado of particles that come out of this object. And it depends on, I'm going to pull this out a little bit further, right? It doesn't matter where this rotation thing is. It's rotating all of these particles. What does matter is the angle speed, right? So if I set this lower to say like 5, right, I'm going to get a much slower rotation of particles. I'm going to rotate this view a bit, right? So it's just much, much slower. If I change that angle speed to something higher, like 300, right, I'm getting rotation, and I'm also getting like a crazy torrent of particles coming out of here, right? It's really, really nuts and kind of beautiful, but not really what I'm looking for, right? So even if I set this to 100, right, I'm going to get more of a spiral of particles, and that's just, something to take note of. If I set this back to, what was it by default, 20? Something like that, I can't even remember. Right, I get something a little bit gentler. Okay, so the other thing that makes a difference is, this position makes some difference. If I pull this closer to the start, it makes a little bit of a change, but not too much. But the other thing that really changes it is what orientation this rotation is happening at, right? If I click and rotate this 90 degrees, those particles are going to start sweeping up, right? It makes a really big difference in the way that the particles are generated, and how, And so that's just something to take note of, is that, right, you can change that orientation, and it really depends on like how the particles are being emitted, what angle they're being emitted at, versus the angle that the particles are rotating at. And so I'm actually getting this beautiful kind of ring of particles right now. And that's not really what I want. What I want is, I love how it affects the particles that are already in the simulation too, right? What I want is something like this. I want this nice, slow-moving cone, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating some particles that are going to be sailing around this rotation, and moving around here. So I'm going to turn turbulence back on too, right? And so what this is going to do is it's going to go ahead and it'll break up and create some turbulence in those things. And so you can already see that that there's these kind of lines of density that have been created by the turbulence and the rotation together. And the turbulence doesn't really take effect until here. And the strength is 5, and the scale is pretty small. If I make the strength 10, right, I might get a little bit more diversity in there. And that's actually really kind of where I'm headed for with this, right? Now, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the simulation. And we're going to reduce the number of particles. And we're going to look at different ways we can use this. So let's go ahead and go to our emitter. Instead of 10,000 or 1,000, let's just do 100 and 100. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust this. And so you can see right now I've got significantly fewer particles. And let's look at, and so, right, I can put any object in an emitter. One of the cool things I can do with an emitter is I can use something that's from this MoGraph menu called a tracer. So if I go to MoGraph and I go down to tracer and I create a tracer, because I had the emitter selected, my trace link is the emitter. And what this is doing is it's creating a spline behind each one of the particles that I've created. Now you can probably see where this is going, right? If I have a spline that I can follow, that I can say maybe sweep another spline along, then suddenly I've got something that's making this really gorgeous geometry that I can use in many, many different ways. So there's a couple things we need to change though. So first, this tracing mode says trace paths. We want that to stay. What we do want to make sure we do is uncheck trace vertices. What trace vertices does is it actually traces every single vertex on your object as it moves through space. And that when you have, say, 100 objects and each one has like 100 vertices, that becomes really problematic. So we're going to uncheck that. And then we can also apply a limit. Uh-oh. Let's pause this as it got fussy with me. So we can also apply a limit. If I say from start and the amount is 1, let's see what happens. All right, so you can see that I'm not getting much. But if I make that, say, 10, oops. Let's go back. Let's see what happens here. Right, so you can see what it's doing is it's making these little tails that are only 10 units long from the start of the spline. But let's go ahead and do from end. And we're going to leave it set to 10. And what this does is it creates these 10 unit long little pieces that come out here, right? So instead of them being these long tendrils that are continuous, I can make something that's significantly shorter. I can make them, and the type, I can make them linear or cubic, right, which is going to smooth out those curves substantially. It's also, you can see, slowing down the simulation substantially. I could do Bezier, which is maybe a little bit faster, but again, it's gonna bend these more gently, right? So let's go ahead and pause this real quick. And so let's go ahead and create an object. Let's create a sweep. So I'm going to go ahead and instead of an extrude, I'm going to go to sweep. And let's create our cross section, right? In this case, let's go ahead and use, we're just going to use a circle. Well, let's use a rectangle to start with because it'll be pretty obvious. And the rectangle's way too big. So let's make our rectangle maybe 4 by 4. And then we're going to make the rectangle and the tracer a child of the sweep. So rectangle, tracer, and you can see what happens almost immediately. Now my particles are these little, like a ton of little rectangles that are being bent around the circle. Now I do have to be careful because, right, if I have a lot of particles at this point, things get really ugly, right? It's going to slow Cinema4D down a lot to be working with all this geometry. So one of the things you can do with the sweep, if you remember, is we can adjust the scale of the objects, right? So they don't have to be these square lumps, or if it was a circle or something, they'd still be like cylindrical. We can taper them, and so to do that, it's easy to do the end scale, right? Because I can just set that to say 0, right? And then I'm going to have these points that are, they're fatter on one side, thinner on the other. That's not really what I want. What I'd like is to have this be, more of a, narrow at both ends. And to do that, it took me forever to find this when I was learning Cinema4D. There's this details tab. And if I flip that open, there's the scale option. And what I can do is I can pull down the start, bend up this curve. I can click on this other end, pull this down to 0 as well, or close to 0, and bend up this curve, right? And so now, and I could add an additional point by holding down Control and clicking on the line, but I can just do this with handles, and I can make these much more elegant forms. And so now if I go back, and I render this, right, now I've got all of these objects that are slowly rotating around. Right, so this is one way that we can use the emitter, right? We can also put any object. We can put generators in there. We can actually have an emitter emitting emitters that are emitting other objects. So there's like all sorts of different things that you can put in there. And I showed an example in class the other day where you can actually just have your emitter as the child of a volume builder, and you can actually creates little like spherical volumes around every one of your points. So if you want to see how to do that really quickly, we're going to use this, but we can turn our sweep off, and we can turn let's turn our cube off on here, and let's go ahead and create a volume builder, and let's make our emitter oops, that was a cloner, wrong object. We probably don't want to clone. I have no idea what would happen if we cloned our emitter. It might be a nightmare. But if I go ahead and make the emitter a child of the volume builder, I should get a volume, but I'm not getting a volume for some reason. I don't know why. Oh, there we go. It looks like I need to have the show objects set, and what that's doing is then that's creating my volumes, right? So my voxel size is 10. If I set it to 5, right, I'm still going to get these voxels, but what's interesting about this is then if I go ahead and use a volume mesher and have those settings set right, I should get some volume in here, but let's see what happens. You can see that I don't think I have enough copies here to do it. So let's go ahead and uncheck that. I'm going to turn the mesher and off, and then under the emitter, I'm going to change the editor birth rate to 1000. I'm going to jump back to frame 0. I'm going to hit run. Here we go. Right, so now you can see that I'm getting all of these things, and if I pause this here, I could also turn the volume builder off and continue to run this a little bit further. I could probably uncheck show objects as well, but let's say that's good. I turn my volume builder back on, and then turn my volume mesher on, and you can see, especially if I hit all that other crap, that I can get these really crazy fluid-like objects that come out of this, right? Because it sort of averages, where these densities are. And then if I go to my volume builder and I have an SDF smooth on there, with 100%, it's like totally gone, but I can smooth things out a little bit. I could also probably add like this dilate and erode, which will actually help, a lot with dilating, and maybe I pull the smooth up above that. There we go. And then smooth this out a touch, right? So there's ways that you can use this to create, these organic, kind of fluid-like forms and shapes using this as an example. Okay, so I'm going to turn those options off because we don't care about that, and I'm also going to turn the show objects option off on my emitter, because all I really care about right now is this sweep. So I've turned this on. Now, remember, I set this to 1000 in my emitter, so I want to reduce that back down to 100. And then I want to jump back and replay my thing. And I'm just going to let this go until, we're a pretty good ways like here. Okay. So how does this go? How does this then become something interesting that we can use? We can use global illumination with. Well, the way that this becomes interesting is making all of these objects luminous. And they're a little big now. We'll shrink them down in a bit, but they're easier to see this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and double-click to create a material. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on luminance. I'll turn off color and reflectance for now. And I'm going to just make this like a nice teal, like a pretty intense teal color. And I'm going to leave all the other settings alone. And I'm going to drag this over, and I'm going to put it on, not on the emitter, I'm going to put it on the sweep. Right, so now I've got all of these objects. And what I can do is I can use this as a light source in a pretty cool, like in a scene. So I can take any object that I want and use it as a way to light this. So I'm going to create a platonic. I'm going to scale my platonic down a touch. And actually, I might also go ahead and create something a little more, maybe a landscape too. Why not? All right, so let's see here. I'm going to rotate this view, and everything is sideways right now, which rather than move the emitter and deal with all of that other stuff, which I should have done earlier, I'm just going to go ahead and rotate my landscape, and then we'll just rotate our view. I'm going to have to letter E to move this. I'm going to pull this down. I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to make sure that that this is in the middle of this. Okay, and so now I've got, my basic scene rotated at 90 degrees to the plane, which, is kind of obnoxious. But so let's see what this looks like as we start to use global illumination. So since this is a new scene, I need to make sure, one, to make my life sane, I'm going to use the physical render engine and do progressive. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn on global illumination. And I'm going to use one of the preview settings, and I'm going to say exterior preview. Although we might want to try HDR image as well. But I'm going to start with exterior preview. And I'm just going to leave everything with the default, and I'm going to go ahead and render it. Right? And so you can see that all of these objects now are illuminating the scene. And I've got a ton of them. I might want to, oops. Oh, because I'm sideways, it's so weird to rotate this in. Let's go ahead. That's a better view. Right, so you can see that these are illuminating this object, and they're illuminating this other object. Now the cube is still, for some reason, showing, even though, there we go. Let's just turn that off. There we are. That looks a little bit cleaner. Right, so I've got these as a source of illumination. So let's go ahead and adjust some settings so we get a bit more brightness in here. Right, so first, we should apply a material to both of these objects. So let's create, a white material that's, maybe it's got a little bit of reflectance on it that's shinier than what we currently have. So, I'm just going to go ahead and add a Beckman. I'm going to leave this normal. I'm going to change the attenuation to additive. But then I'm going to reduce the stuff, and I'm going to hide the default specular. And so I'm going to go ahead and apply that both to my landscape, and hopefully it's not too shiny, we'll find out really quick, and to this object. Let's go ahead and render this, right? So already you can see how nice these light reflections are on this, and you can see it reflecting on here. I might want that reflection to be a little bit lower, but I also, right, these are pretty flat right now. So I'm going to go ahead and take my luminance. I'm going to set the brightness to 200%. So it's a little bit more vibrant in the way that it lights up the scene. And you can see already, right, that looks, like they're lit. It looks like they're glowing because it's casting this bluish light on everything else in the scene. And I'm getting a pretty intense amount of noise in terms of, the lighting density and intensity on the surfaces of these objects. Right? You can see as these get closer, the intensity gets a lot brighter. Okay, so that's even, and now if I'm happy with how bright those are, I can always come down to illumination and say, oh, I really want it to be stronger. Right? So I really want this to be, another 200% in terms of how much GI it's generating. Right? And so when I go ahead and do that, it brightens the scene up a bit more. This is starting to get washed out. So maybe I just want that at 125%. Okay. Right? And I'm not 100% happy with how that surface looks. Maybe I want to make some adjustments to this material. Like I want that reflectance to be a little less, and maybe I want a little bit more noise in there too. Let's go ahead and that's a little bit better. All right, so let's say we're happy with this. It's not the most amazing scene in the whole world, but it's giving us some options. So let's go ahead and frame this in a way where we can get a good sense of our scene. Now, something we can do if let's say that we want these objects to have a bit more volume or intensity to them, we can, with this material, we could potentially reduce the brightness of our luminance. Like we've got it set to 200%. We could dial that down some. We could use diffusion to calm it down. If we turn on reflectance and turn on our color channel, and maybe make our color like a darker blue or something like that, we might be able to get a little bit more variation in the color on there, but no matter what, these are going to be pretty flat. All right, so let's go ahead and make them a little bit smaller because they are a pretty dense block of materials on this surface. So let's go ahead and, with our rectangle selected, let's make this 2 by 2. All right, so there we go. So that's thinning those out a lot. And then we could even make these a little shorter with our tracer. So if I select the tracer, right, and say maybe the amount should be 5, right, and then if I jump back and I run this again, right, now I'm getting much smaller little particles that are flowing up. Right, and so, it's up to you. You can see that also greatly reduces the amount of light that's in the scene because the objects are smaller, and so there's less surface area to emit light. But let's say that I'm happy with this. From here, what we can do is we can go ahead and let's render this out, and then we'll look at how we bring it into Cinema4D to or into Photoshop to get some glow on here. So I'm going to go ahead and, I've got my render settings, and just to make sure my emitter is set the same here, so it should look the same. And I'm just going to render this to the picture viewer with whatever my default image settings are. And I have it set to progressive, so I'm just going to let it do several progressive passes. Again, I'm not super concerned with the quality of this because it's just a demo. I just want to show you how to get the basics down. Obviously, it would be better to use like the automatic settings for the render engine or whatever. But I'm just doing, it's like 35 passes now. There's still some noise in here and some other things that could be cleaned up. But I'm going to go ahead and stop it where it is. And yes, I want to stop it. And then this is actually what it should look like. I had this filter on from another thing and it just kept it there. But if I go to history, I should, oops. Oh, I think it renamed this. This is another project. I don't know why it just popped in there. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this file. I'm going to set it as a TIFF. I'm going to leave the color depth. I'm going to leave it at 8 bits for now. I'm going to hit OK. And if I think about it, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save it in this folder. I'm just going to call it glow test. And then I'm going to open up Photoshop. Okay, so I'm going to open this file. And hopefully everything will work. Okay, so I've got this file. I'm going to hit Command 0 so it's full screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer. So I'm going to right click on it, duplicate layer. And sure, I'll just call it background copy, I don't care. And then in Photoshop, the way you do this is you go to Filter, and you go down to Blur, and we could do Gaussian, it'll work fine. And Then I'm going to go ahead and increase this a little bit to 1.2. Now, something I may want to do instead of the way that I'm doing this is I may want to cancel this, and I may want to go to filter and say convert for smart filters. This will allow me to continue to adjust the filter settings as I go forward. So now that I've done that, let's go ahead and change but first we're going to change this mode to something additive, right? So overlay is additive. That might be a good option. Let's go ahead and go to overlay, and then we're going to go to filter and blur and Gaussian blur. And we're going to increase our radius on this. Now you'll see as the radius gets bigger, anything that's really brightly lit starts to get more of a glow. If I go too big, right, it's going to actually do the opposite. But within reason, I'm going to get, right, I'm going to hit OK, right, I get this sense that it's glowing now. So if I turn this off, you'll see that, right, it's changed a little bit. But if I turn this on and I go through here, I can adjust the different ways that this works, right? So if I go to screen, for instance, or lighten, right, I can get, screen is actually really probably my best bet here. You can see, like, as I go through these different options, right, some of the ways that this changes, right? You know, and so I think probably the best option for this is the one I'm most happy with is screen. Right? And then since this is a smart filter, right, I can double click on Gaussian blur, and if it's too blurry and too glowy, right, or more so, I can make that adjustment as needed to get this dialed into the way that I want it to be. And now you can see with screen, I can really blast it out and get more of like almost a hazy effect as well on top of the whole object. Right? So this is a way that I can take my default scene from Cinema4D and give it a little bit more pop in Photoshop. Okay, and then I would save it and submit it. I could also apply other adjustments. If I wanted to do some color correction, or if I wanted to, adjust levels, things like that, adjust my exposure. These are all things that I could then, come in here and do. And this is, right, the exposure. You can see that if I increase the exposure a bit, I can really get a lot more glow in there. And it just really depends on how you want to go with this. All right. So there are some other softwares that you can use to do this, and we don't need this up, but there is this this program called GIMP that is available for everything, and I have not used it recently, but it's totally free, and you can use it as a digital painting program. You can do photo manipulation stuff with it. Basically everything in the world has blur and has different blend modes for layers. And so you should be able to use this pretty interchangeably with Photoshop in that sense. Something else that might work, but I haven't really looked at recently, is a painting program called Krita. And it's another one where it is, absolutely free. And, it's more meant to be for illustration. But you should be able to bring images into and maybe do some manipulation with that, with filters. But really their focus is digital illustration. So, yeah, those are two options for other software that's free that you can use to do those final steps.